The revival of 1800 was a series of evangelical Christian meetings which began in Logan County, Kentucky, which ignited the subsequent events and influenced several of the leaders of the Second Great Awakening. The events represented a transition from traditions carried over from Europe to innovations that responded to the unique needs and personality of Americans in the new century. The startling manifestations of revival fervor that first occurred in June 1800 at the Red River Meeting House, a small Presbyterian congregation led by James McGready, began as a Scottish sacrament service, but brought about the important innovation of serial religious services later known as camp meetings. These multi-day gatherings hosted people from great distances for outdoor services focused on the heartfelt conversion and religious enthusiasm that came to characterize especially rural evangelicalism throughout the 19th century. The Logan County revival quickly spread into the larger Cumberland region of southwestern Kentucky and Middle Tennessee and expanded outward in all directions, attracting the attention of evangelical leaders such as Presbyterian-turned-Disciples of Christ leader Barton Stone, and Methodists Francis Asbury and Peter Cartwright, as well as leaders in the Shaker and Cumberland Presbyterian movements, all of whom attended the revival meetings in their initial year-long period beginning in June 1800 and continuing through May 1801. Background: North Carolina. James McGready arrived in Logan County in 1797, but he had become a seasoned revivalist in North Carolina. His first congregation had been in Guilford County, North Carolina, a center of evangelical Presbyterian revivals in the late 1780s and early 1790s. The churches were recovering from the cultural readjustment of post-revolutionary America that, in many cases, left institutional religion in a weakened state. As states disestablished the churches following the war, the Anglican Church in the South was particularly affected, having fallen out of favor during the Revolution because of its association with Great Britain. More than this, the country showed a general lack of interest in religion, focusing instead on populating the West, regaining economic footing, and creating a new nation. In addition, well-publicized attacks on Christianity came from deists Ethan Allen, the hero of Fort Ticonderoga, and Thomas Paine, the famous author of Common Sense. In 1794, Paine published The Age of Reason, which attacked supernatural elements of Christianity in favor of rationalist philosophy. In Guilford County, and in the Carolinas generally, the war had been especially cruel. One 19th-century chronicler blamed the march of armies for leaving plunder, vice, dissipation and immorality in its way. It was within this post-war setting that McGready took part in several sporadic revivals, first in Virginia, at Hampton-Sydney College, and then in Guilford County in 1791 in conjunction with the school where several of his future colleagues, including Barton Stone, studied for a career in politics under Presbyterian David Caldwell. McGready's hard-hitting sermons on the sinfulness of people and the need for conversion demanded a response beyond intellectual assent to the tenets of Christianity. McGready advocated a heartfelt and sensible religion centered on the doctrine of regeneration, or the new birth. McGready's preaching, however, was not without controversy. His appeals were convincing to Stone in regard to his sinfulness, but were no source of relief from the state of his tortured soul. Calvinist doctrine, as taught by the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, espoused limited atonement, the belief that Christ's sacrifice for sin was available only to those who had been predestined. Years later, Stone would reflect that he had anticipated a long and painful struggle before why should get religion. For 1 year I was tossed on the waves of uncertainty, sometimes desponding and almost despairing. Stone eventually responded, with a sense of his own conversion, to the appeals of one of McGready's associates, William Hodge, who spoke not of the flames of hell, but of the love of God for sinners. Others in the community responded to McGready, not with contrition, but threats. One Sunday, McGready arrived at his church to discover a bloody note accompanying his burned-out pulpit, demanding that he leave the area or face the consequences. Responding to an invitation to minister in Logan County, Kentucky, McGready soon left North Carolina. Several ministers with whom he had worked in Guilford County, including William Hodge, John Rankin, William Mcgregor, and the brothers John and William McGee, would eventually join him to minister in various congregations in the Cumberland frontier of Middle Tennessee in southwestern Kentucky. In the 1790s, many of the socio-religious conditions in Kentucky mirrored those of the country in general in post-revolutionary America. McGready complained that Kentuckians were worldly people whose conversations were of corn and tobacco, or land and stock. The name of Jesus has no charms, and it is rarely mentioned unless to be profaned. Indeed, the rush for land represented a change in post-war demographics that were perhaps nowhere as dramatic as in Kentucky. In 1790, the population was about 73,000, roughly 16% of whom were slaves, with most of the population concentrated in the central bluegrass area near Lexington. By 1800, the population had almost tripled to 221,000, and had expanded farther west, spurred by the decisive Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. This defeat of Confederated Indian tribes near Toledo, Ohio, by General Anthony Wayne, effectively ended the threat of Indian attack in Kentucky by the middle of the decade. Though people of all classes came to Kentucky, the influx of large numbers of the poor in search of land produced a dramatic effect on the country as a whole. The 1800 United States Census revealed that 7% of the U.S. population lived west of the Alleghenies in what is now Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. By 1810, the population in Kentucky had swelled to almost double that of 1800, to 406,000. Early settlers were fiercely independent and egalitarian, skilled with the long rifle, and fond of fighting, gambling, tobacco chewing, and horse racing. Church attendance was sparse even in settled areas, largely because of the slow appearance of ministers until after 1794. By 1799, there were only 26 licensed Presbyterian ministers in Kentucky. Sectarian controversies were common among the churches in the more settled areas, and in the backcountry where few churches existed. Early Methodist itinerates like Francis Asbury rode on horseback thousands of miles yearly to establish circuits which would reach remote settlements. In 1796, the same year McGready came to Kentucky, Asbury quoted in his journal the dismal prediction he had heard about the region: "The ministers in Kentucky will be a curse to each other, and the people too. Good religion and good land are not so easily matched together." The Scottish Sacrament season. When McGready came to Logan County, he brought with him a long tradition known as the Scottish Sacrament season, which was still being practiced regularly by Presbyterian congregations. Begun after the tumultuous changes of the Scottish Reformation in the mid-17th century, the Sacrament season became a replacement for Catholic Corpus Christi festivals, and served as a response to fears that Protestant religion had lost its communal expression, making religion an increasingly privatized affair. The Sacrament season occurred over several days in warm weather months. It included outdoor preaching, large numbers of people often traveling long distances, long vigils of prayer, and often dramatic conversion experiences. One of the largest of these observances occurred in Cambuslang, outside Glasgow, Scotland, in 1742, where upwards of 30,000 people came to hear the preaching of George Whitefield. Sacrament observances such as Cambuslang, whose timing coincided with the Great Awakening in England, Ireland, and the American colonies throughout the 1740s, had become associated with revivalism, and both clergy and lay people reflected the expectation that the communion season would bring the most intense religious experiences, the most agonizing despair and the most ecstatic joy. Scottish sacrament observances were recreated in America in the early 18th century when large numbers of Ulster Scots immigrated to the colonies. During the Great Awakening in the American colonies, Irish Presbyterian revivalists William and Gilbert Tennant presided over the communion festivals, while Congregationalist David Brainerd also followed the Scottish pattern in his missionary work among American Indians. The four-day pattern was common. Friday was designated as a day of fasting and prayer. On Saturday, further inward preparation continued with preaching, usually by several ministers. Sunday was the observance of the Lord's Supper, and Monday was a day of thanksgiving. The focus of the sacrament season was participation in the Lord's Supper. For Scots-Irish Presbyterians, inclusion in this ritual was guarded closely and accompanied by several symbols of exclusivity. First, preparation was necessarily on the part of the communicant as well as the ministers charged with interviewing each person in advance and approving his sincerity and worthiness. Communion tokens, small emblems made usually from leaden stamped with the date, and sometimes the initials of the minister, were required for admission to communion. These were given only to those the minister approved, and had to be surrendered to an elder by every person approaching the communion table. A second symbol of exclusivity was the fencing of the tables, set apart from the rest of the congregation. These tables were often covered with the best and finest linens available and sometimes actually fenced with a rail, as the minister described the qualifications of communicants as a further barrier against those who had not been formally invited and approved. Once admitted to the table, the exclusivity ended as all participants, male and female, young and old, cleric and lay person, served one another common bread and wine representing the body and blood of Christ. The often intense preparation and elements of exclusivity meant that only a fraction of those who attended these events actually participated in the communion ritual. Others were children and observers who were unsure of the status as among the converted, and many were curious bystanders and irreligious people who had come for social rather than religious reasons. Like the 19th century revivals, the spectacle of the sacrament season, both inside and outside the meeting house, and the large influx of people coming for diverse reasons from considerable distances, sometimes produced a carnival-like atmosphere. It is clear that McGready saw a connection between the sacrament season and revival. In his written account of the events of 1800, 16 of 17 revival meetings were connected to sacrament observances. However, McGready also revealed his openness to innovations associated with distinctly American influences as well, and actively promoted the introduction of the camp meeting into the sacrament tradition in Pioneer, Kentucky, Logan County. In 1797, James McGready was granted a minister's license in Logan County, Kentucky. In January of 1797, as the area's first resident Presbyterian minister, he led 3 small congregations. The largest was Red River, with about 25 members. The other two were at Gasper River and Muddy Rivers. The Red River congregation had been pioneered by Thomas Craighead, who, in 1785, was the first minister to serve the Kentucky frontier community from his base in the Nashville, Tennessee area. Craighead, a graduate of the College of New Jersey, provided a sharp contrast to the plain-spoken McGready, a graduate of a small log college in Pennsylvania led by John Macmillan, himself a graduate of the College of New Jersey and the first Presbyterian to establish a church west of the Alleghenies. The difference between Craighead and McGready were stark. If Dr. Craighead was more graceful in his manner, polished in his style, said one man who had heard both men preach, Mr. McGready was more earnest, and solemn in his appeals to the conscience. Not long after he arrived in Logan County, McGready began trying to convince the people of his congregations of the need for a religion that was experiential and life-altering. By May of his first year, some in his Gasper River congregation felt the first stirrings of revival when 8 or 9 people were converted. But the excitement was short-lived, and the winter saw a return to spiritual malaise. At this point, McGready instituted regular prayer and fasting to be observed in the churches on the last Saturday of each month. By the summer of 1798, the Sacrament observances were the site of more conversions. But criticism circulated by a rival Presbyterian minister named James Balch, recently arrived from another community, brought conflict and doubt, and according to McGready, quelled the enthusiasm, so that again, stagnation followed. In July of the following year, McGready noticed a remarkable spirit of prayer and supplication, a sensible, heartfelt burden of the dreadful state of sinners among those in his congregations. At Red River, McGready reported the conversion of bold and daring sinners, weeping bitterly. At the subsequent Sacrament at Gasper River, he reported the first incidences of a phenomenon that would continue to characterize the assemblies, people falling in swoons with groans and loud cries for mercy, often lying helpless for hours. Similar results followed at subsequent Sacrament observances as McGready and other area ministers traveled throughout the Cumberland region to congregations at Muddy River, Clay Lake, and The Ridge, a congregation in Tennessee. The revival begins, summer 1800, the Sacrament at Red River in June 1800. McGready was joined at Red River by several area Presbyterian ministers, including William Hodge, John Rankin, and the brothers, William and John McGee, the latter a Methodist minister who, some years later, wrote his account for the Methodist Missionary magazine. His narrative painted a vivid picture of the revival's beginnings. All was silent until Monday, the last day of the feast. While Mr. Hodge was preaching, a woman in the East End got an uncommon blessing, broke through order, and shouted for some time and then sat down in silence. McGee continued, relating that most of the ministers were already gathered outside the meeting house while the people remained seated inside, unwilling to leave, when his brother, William, felt such a power come on him that he quit his seat and sat down in the floor of the pulpit. John McGee began to tremble as weeping erupted through the congregation. The woman in the East End began to shout again, and McGee started toward her just as someone reminded him that his Presbyterian hosts were much for order and would not hear this confusion. "Go back and be quiet." McGee turned to go back and was near falling when he changed his mind and went through the house shouting and exhorting with all possible ecstasy and energy. Quote, using the term that came to be associated with the revival phenomenon of collapsing in a state of physical helplessness, McGee continued. The floor was soon covered with the slain. The screams for mercy pierced the heavens. The first camp meetings in Kentucky, The religious excitement at Red River inspired what would later become a regular feature of Kentucky revivalism, camping at the site. Previous to 1800, long-distance travelers attending the multi-day Sacrament observance would make arrangements to stay with neighboring families. But as the news of the revival spread, the combination of the people's desire to linger, and the practicalities associated with the needs of large numbers of people from great distances, inspired families to come prepared to camp at the site. McGready realized the potential for the innovation when protracted meetings continued into the night, and one family at Red River came ready to camp for the duration. He began to publicize the idea of camping on the grounds for the next Sacrament observance to be held the following month at Gasper River. People responded and several wagons loaded with provisions arrived ready to camp for the July observance. By the time the meetings occurred at the congregations of Muddy River and at several other congregations in Tennessee and Kentucky in the late summer and fall of 1800, camping had become common. The numbers attending, and those converted, had continued to grow, as did the number of ministers who preached and directed the Sacrament observances. John McGee reported that most were Presbyterians and Methodists. Baptists were generally opposed to the work, but a few of the pastors also joined the revivals as well. The revival expands. McGrady's account. Writing in 1801, McGready characterized the revivals of the previous summer and fall as the most glorious time that our guilty eyes have ever beheld. Less narrative and descriptive than McGee's, McGrady's accounts focused on the chronological unfolding of events. McGrady's Calvinist beliefs prevented him from pronouncing with certainty that a person had been converted. He believed that only God knew for sure, but he made attempts, judging by the evidence at hand, to count the conversions that began in the summer sacraments of 1800. The numbers showed an accumulating and broadening effect. In June at Red River, 10 were converted. In July at Gasper River, 45, as well as some Tennessee youths who returned home and encouraged the experience of real religion among 20 of the friends and neighbors. The Gasper River event hosted people from as distant as 100 miles away. 13 wagons were employed to transport people and supplies, and the excitement was so great that some stayed at the meeting house through the night. In early August, on a Sunday, church services at Red River, several black people and children were affected. Later that month, 22 wagons arrived at the Muddy River Sacrament with more than 50 converted throughout the multi-day observance. The revival meetings continued throughout the fall with similar and escalating response among the people. Significantly, McGready mentioned the attendance and approval of fellow Presbyterian minister and Logan County predecessor, Dr. Thomas Craighead, when the meetings were held at the Ridge, a Tennessee congregation where over 50 were converted, including 2 of Craighead's children. Attendance at the various meetings continued to grow, with 5,000 reported at Hodges Shiloh congregation in Tennessee in September. The pace became demanding as McGready crisscrossed Kentucky and Tennessee, rushing from one sacrament to the other before the onset of winter. McGready exulted in the revival at one community, 100 miles from Logan County at the red banks of the Ohio River, where professed deists became warm and lively Christians. Poor accommodations and wet weather did not slow the pace in October at Clay Lick, described by McGready as a small congregation with only a small cabin for a meeting house, where there were 80 souls brought to Jesus. John Rankin carried the revival into eastern Tennessee and North Carolina in the fall of 1800, as the radius increasingly expanded outward from Logan County. McGready recorded several incidents of people affecting the friends and neighbors after they had returned home, planting true religion in careless and profane settlements where no professors lived. Quote, Although his account was not published until 1803, there is evidence from others, including Francis Asbury, that McGready's written testimony circulated much earlier.